Thank you for joining us for this informative American Institute of Chemical Engineers webinar, excuse me, sponsored by Providence Consulting, The Importance of Operating Procedures. Our speaker is Justin Phillips. Justin Phillips has over 8 years of onshore and offshore oil and gas process engineering and project execution experience. His technical experience includes process design with specialty in flare and relief systems. Justin is the Relief Systems line of service manager at Providence Consulting, LLC. He holds a BS in chemical engineering from Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas, and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Texas. One quick note before I turn the session over to Justin. As described more fully on this slide, the American Institute of Chemical Engineers assumes no legal liability or responsibility for the use or misuse of the content in this webinar. And now I'd like to welcome Justin Phillips. Hi, Justin.
Hi, Pam. Thank you very much for the introduction. And also my thanks to AICHE for asking me to come back and present some more webinars this year. Thanks to everybody that's joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of operating procedures. Before I really get into it, sometimes at the end of these webinars we do not have enough time to answer all of the questions. One of the things that I want to let everybody know is that if you have a question and you ask it and we do not have time to get to it, don't worry. At the very end of this webinar, Pamela will take all of those questions and send them my way. What I do is I take all those questions, provide answers as well as I can, and ensure that those questions and answers are in the PDF of this slide set at the very back end. So if your question is not answered at the end, don't worry. We'll get to it with the published PDF of this slideshow. So as some of you may know, the person who is going to be presenting today is Patrick Nonhoff, who is a managing partner at Providence Consulting. However, there's a scheduling conflict and he was not able to present today. Instead of punishing you guys and girls, we decided to do an upgrade to this webinar. So instead of Patrick, you're going to get me. I'm much more fun, I'm approachable, and I'm dead serious about being fun and approachable. Also dead serious about process safety. Operating procedures are pretty important to me, and so I want to share their importance with you. Today we're going to discuss operating procedures, what the definition is, what their purpose is, what the requirements of operating procedures are, because you can't just write whatever you want. We're going to talk about how operating procedures are an integrated part of process safety management, common pitfalls associated with operating procedures. We're going to go through some case studies. We're going to talk about training personnel, what's required for training personnel, and also some of our recommendations for training. We'll talk about long-term management of operating procedures. We'll provide a summary, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So in general, the information that I'm going to talk about today, it's going to seem very common. It's going to make a lot of sense. I'm not going to need to convince you a whole lot. And so it's not that you're going to be learning something that you can't agree with or that's a new and novel idea. I think what is going to be iterated throughout this presentation is that even though the things that we discuss about operating procedures, all the good stuff and all the good reasons we have for having them, that's not the important part. The important part is that it's hardly ever practiced. We talk about all these great things we can do with operating procedures, but the problem is that a lot of institutions and a lot of organizations don't implement good practices. I do have a couple of objectives from today's presentation. The first is that everybody understands why operating procedures are essential to safe operation of any facility. Understand what OSHA's requirements are, especially with regard to PSM, so PSM-covered facilities like refineries or chemical plants here in the United States. And then also for the audience to become aware of problems and pitfalls and maybe some case studies associated with bad operating procedures. So what are operating procedures? The most basic definition of an operating procedure is a written instruction set that tells you how to do something. We see it in every aspect of our lives, and it's not just at work, it's at home. You know, cookbooks, putting together furniture, medical procedures that doctors follow. They don't just think about it on the fly. There's a procedure to go through. All of the tasks have one thing in common. It's that the results should match the intent of the operating procedure. And so it's important that operating procedures produce safe, reliable, and repeatable results. Operating procedures in a process facility like a chemical plant or a refinery or a production platform or any other place like that is no different. You want to make sure that those operating procedures, that when they're followed, reduce deviation from designed intentional actions. Why do we need operating procedures? Well, I think some of this is going to be really obvious. First, to ensure safe operations. You want to make sure that people go home just as well as they came to work or even better by preventing injuries and problems with health. You also want to communicate health and safety precautions to folks as they're doing their daily routines. You want to ensure consistent product quality because you always want to follow a given set of instructions and the given timing associated with your process to make sure that the product comes out at an acceptable quality level. It's also to protect profitability. So not only do we have to worry about people's health and people's livelihood, we need to make sure that we treat our processes correctly, treat our equipment the way that it should be treated according to procedures so that we don't have a mistake, so we don't have an accident, explosion, something that damages our property or worse, hurt somebody, because when that happens, it's really expensive. We also want to establish accountability. So well-written instructions will tell you exactly who is supposed to perform which step. And the other reason, of course, is because of regulatory compliance. It's the law, and it says it plain as day in 29 CFR 1910-119. That's the long-form version of the PSM standard. It's a federal law. It's what OSHA uses. Sorry, not what OSHA uses. What OSHA enforces for PSM-covered facilities, and it's plain as day in Section 3F. Operating procedures. The employer shall develop and implement written operating procedures, period. So why does PSM require operating procedures? Well, kind of like we said before, we want to protect personnel from injuries and fatalities. And because not following standard operating procedures can lead to operators or users performing steps incorrectly or inconsistently, which can lead to problems, incidents, loss of containment, fires. Operating procedures, according to OSHA, PSM, are required for numerous different activities, including but not limited to initial startup, normal operation, temporary operation, emergency shutdown, emergency operations, normal shutdown, startup following a turnaround or after an emergency shutdown, all types of situations. You want to make sure that you have the right set of instructions for whatever situation your facility is running in. In addition to that, the operating procedures must also provide clear instructions on how to do stuff. They've got to be readily accessible. You can't rely on somebody having to run to a library half a plant away to go find operating instructions. They need to be able to find those procedures where they're working. Those operating procedures need to contain the operating limits and the consequences of deviation. It's fine to tell somebody, follow step 1, then follow step 2, but it's also important to say if you don't follow step 1 and you don't follow step 2, bad things can happen. It's important to detail the safety and health hazards and considerations. So for instance, for a given task, you may require certain PPE, certain things to protect yourself, goggles, hard hats, steel-toe boots, things like that. So it's important that those operating procedures also tell you what type of tools, equipment, and PPE you need before you start performing a task. And also there needs to be a certification process that has a frequency of at least 1 year. You need to make sure, not only check the procedures and make sure that they're right, but also check that the users are familiar with the procedures, know where to find them, and know how to follow those procedures. With respect to the rest of process safety management, so you can think of operating procedures as one component of OSHA's PSM standard. Well, it's not just a component by itself that sits in a vacuum. It relies on and contains multiple other components of process safety management, including PSI. So for instance, your operating procedures are going to make reference to the process hazards, which is covered in PSI section 3D1. It also has to contain the process description and the chemistry involved, the operating limits. You can't run too hot, you can't run too cold, your pressure can't be too high, it can't be too low. It needs to include the consequences of deviation. It needs to contain information on interlock controls, things that are automatically there to keep you safe. Also needs to include information on the process equipment that users are going to be manipulating. In addition to PSI, it's also part of the MOC process. So whenever there's a change to a process, a healthy or robust MOC program will pick up the changes to the process. It'll make updates to the PSI, for instance, your PNIDs or your process chemistry. Likewise, that MOC process should also recognize that if there's changes to the process, there may be changes to the operating procedures. And in addition to MOC and PSI, you can also leverage those operating procedures in a PHA, a process hazard analysis. And why? Well, because those operating procedures describe the task that the users are performing. It talks about the consequences of doing the wrong thing at the wrong time or not taking a certain step. It lists the consequences of going outside of design limits, outside of your safe zones. Talks about critical procedures that may be taken as safeguards in certain situations. And then when you're taking a look at operating procedures, not with the mindset of I'm just here to update the operating procedures, but when you're taking a look at it with cold eyes during a PHA, you might be able to see systemic problems in your operating procedures just because you're taking out of its normal context and looking at it in a PHA. Moving on to common pitfalls. So I've talked about all of this stuff that makes operating procedures so great, and it makes so much sense, and I don't need to convince anybody that all of those things are good ideas or are necessary. But what are some of the problems associated with operating procedures? Well, the biggest problem is people not using them. There's a couple of factors that lead to operating procedure disuse, and these are things that I think may resonate with those of you out there that are working in operating facilities. It's certainly things that I've seen in my experience. First and foremost, procedures get outdated. They're not updated when things change, and they're kind of left to themselves and left to kind of crumble and rot. Old procedures may have incorrect set points, incorrect operating conditions. Maybe you changed all the equipment tags in your plant a long time ago, and so the equipment numbers don't make any sense anymore. And then after some period of use, operators get used to doing things a certain way, and so they say, hey, these operating procedures, they need to be updated based on how we actually do our work, because we think, you know, doing it in this form and fashion makes more sense. But those operating procedures, they never get corrected, and they never incorporate that important feedback from operators. What else? Employees may not know where to go to locate the procedures, and they may be out of date. They go to a place, they've been going to it for years, but maybe that's not the place where the updated operating procedures are. Maybe it's been changed to a different location and people didn't know it. Operating procedures that are too wordy, complex, or have language that is way too descriptive. I think engineers have a tendency to make things overly complicated and overly detailed because you want to make sure that it contains all the information that somebody could possibly want to see. And so when engineers write operating procedures, you know, in a vacuum, they produce these pages of rich text full of all of this great information in it. And if you take a piece of paper and hold it away from your face, you know, maybe a foot or two away, it just looks like a gray blob. Well, yeah, it's great. It contains all that wonderful information. But if you need to use it in the field, you don't want to spend the time to look at something that looks like a gray blob. It needs to be written with concise language. On the flip side, there may be operating procedures that are written very poorly, that have grammatical errors, that have syntax errors, that have all sorts of erroneous information or poorly written information that people can't understand. What else? Employees may not know when to use those operating procedures because it doesn't clearly say who is supposed to be performing which step. It doesn't establish ownership. It doesn't establish who should be doing what. And then also it may not tell you when you're supposed to use that operating procedure as far as the situation goes. So if you've just got one set of operating procedures for a process, is that set of procedures okay for normal operation and emergency shutdown? Is it also valid for startup under normal conditions or only under emergency restart conditions? If it's not clear, it may lend itself to not being used. And then another problem, employees don't know how to use the operating procedures. You could have the best operating procedures in the world, but if you don't train anybody how to use them, then they may as well be useless. Extremely long and intricate procedures also kind of ties into those overly wordy and complex ones, where you have pages of gray blobs. And if it's overly long and takes too long to do, that may lend itself to operators bypassing the instructions, cutting corners in order to get their work done. Time constraints lay on everybody, and so if something is too difficult or too timely to take care of, people are going to cut corners. One bit of advice is that if you've got a really risky sort of process and the procedures to control or operate that process are very complex, or they take a long time, or the process in general is just really, really, really risky, you may want to consider changing the process, not changing the procedures, but going back to an inherently safer design mindset and changing the process. Additional pitfalls: mismanagement of operating procedures. So using old, outdated paper-based systems, not making that leap into an electronic-based system, not maintaining a centralized location, which goes back to employees not being able to find them, and then not effectively tracking changes made in new revisions. We can sit here and complain, I can sit here and complain all day long about bad operating procedures, but complaining about it doesn't solve the problem, not a bit. And so I think this is maybe the difficult part is, well, how do you overcome those problems? The first thing is you have to understand that it will take time. You've got to just admit it to yourself that fixing a problem with operating procedures does take time. It's not going to fix itself overnight, and nobody else is necessarily going to fix it. If you really, really, really want to make a difference, it's probably important that you gain the backing of your supervision by using convincing arguments. You could use this webinar if you wanted to, or you could use some of the case studies that we're going to talk about. You've got to own the problem. If nobody else is going to own the problem of having bad operating procedures, somebody has to. So why don't you? There's no magic bullets to this. It's just perseverance. It's sticking it through and seeing it to completion. We're going to talk about some case studies. One thing I thought was really interesting, for those of you not familiar with CSB, CSB is a chemical safety board. They do a lot of great work, and they have a lot of very, very valuable information for our industries, for chemical engineering industries, refining, production, chemical plants, specialty chemicals, all kinds of great stuff. There was a study that CSB did a number of years ago on 167 serious incidents involving just chemical reaction, like runaway reactions and that sort of thing. And it spanned from like the 80s through maybe the end of the early 2000s, some large time frame. What they found in all of those incidents was they found a lot of common causal factors, but in 50% of those cases, they found that inadequate, missing, or otherwise bad operating procedures could be attributed to those incidents. So that if there were good operating procedures, it could have mitigated that number. Talking about some individual case studies, there was one in Pitkin, Louisiana, a number of years ago by Sonat Exploration Company. I think today, I don't know if Sonat exists anymore. I think it may be owned by El Paso now. A number of years ago, they were performing some sort of procedure. I think they were blowing down a line or blowing down a vessel or doing something. Workers at this facility, they did not have written operating procedures on how to align valves correctly for a purging operation. What was the outcome? Well, they inadvertently introduced high-pressure gas, flammable gas, into a low-pressure system that was not protected with a PSV. So there's a number of problems here. Low-pressure system not protected by a PSV, so there's inadequate release systems. But also, there's not an operating procedure to tell people how to open the valves and in which order to do it. And so guesswork led to 4 fatalities. Another example, at Inspec Chemical Corp in Petrolia, Pennsylvania, back in 2008, key finding from this instance was that there were operating procedures that did not cover the proper use of emergency power supply. So years and years and years ago, this facility, they have some pumps, and the pumps are hooked up to the regular power supply. And they use these pumps for transferring oleum, which is fuming sulfuric acid, back and forth between tanks to different parts of the process or what have you. Well, they also installed an emergency power supply just in case the regular power supply was not available, so they'd always have some source of power to take care of business. There was no interlocks installed on the emergency supply, so whenever they were pumping in normally with the regular pumps under normal power, they'd fill up a tank, and if it got, if the level got too high, the power would automatically shut off. There was an interlock which would turn off the pump. That sort of interlock system was not used on the emergency power supply. Well, in the operating procedures never addressed the emergency power supply. So over years, operators became used to using both the regular power supply and the emergency power supply to transfer oleum into tanks because you could do it a lot faster. You could get your job done in half the time. Well, somebody took their eye off the ball, and there became an overfill situation. The regular power supply shut off with the interlocks. The emergency one did not, and it overfilled and caused loss of containment. Nobody died, but it did require thousands of people to be evacuated to avoid fuming sulfuric acid. Another case study, Honeywell at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. There was a number of incidents which occurred in the summer of 2003. One of these incidents, there were some operating procedures that did not provide guidance for non-routine situations. It lacked consequences of deviation, and they also found that sometimes the operating procedures were sidestepped. People would cut corners in order to do things faster or, in their minds, more efficiently. The problem here is that for one part of this process, operators would expect to see these one-ton cylinders of a certain color to be filled with a refrigerant, which was not a bad, nothing to worry about. They'd be able to open it, get rid of the excess refrigerant, and then get those empty cylinders ready for some other use. Well, on this day, back in 2003, an operator received a cylinder which was not painted and didn't look the same as the other cylinders, but it was mislabeled. It said, hey, this just contains refrigerant. So the operator tried to get it open, opened it up, and unfortunately found that the cylinder was full of antimony pentachloride, which is not what he expected. He was exposed to antimony pentachloride, and he died the next day simply because the cylinder was mislabeled, and it looked a little bit funny, and he thought it was just refrigerant. There was no operating procedure that said, hey, if it looks funny, if it looks different, caution. It should only look like this. Only work on the cylinders that look like this. If it looks like something else, check it. Make sure that it is what you think it is. That didn't happen here, and somebody died. A few days later, at the same facility, after they had some emergency shutdowns because of another incident that occurred, say, 20 days prior, they were getting everything started back up, and they found that one of their exchangers had some leftover hydrogen fluoride in it, and they needed to get it out of the equipment before they started up. Well, there was no drain system that they could use, and so they used an ad hoc Venturi stick, which is, if you can think of like a bug sprayer, like an ortho bug sprayer, you kind of pump it up, and then you pull the trigger, and then it squirts out the bug spray just based on the air pressure that you've added to the system. Well, they did a similar setup here, but there was no specific operating procedures on draining hydrogen fluoride from the process equipment with a Venturi stick. So people knew how to jury rig a Venturi stick, but there was no fixed operating procedure on how to do it for this piece of equipment in this part of the process. So the outcome, this ad hoc jury rigged setup did not adequately control the hazard. It kind of broke loose. There was a hose, and you can see it in the picture on the left-hand side of the picture. That hose became loose, and it started, whipping around and spraying operators with hydrogen fluoride, which is not good. It had required 2 hospitalizations. Thankfully, nobody died, but that was not a good summer for Honeywell. Continuing on to other places where operating procedures didn't work out. Central Illinois Public Service Company, although I don't think they're PSM covered, this is still like a power generation plant. They've got cooling water systems that require acid in some cases and bases in another. Well, there's this sodium hydroxide truck driver that came in, did not follow the operating procedures to not inadvertently mix H2SO4 because they realized, the CIPS realized that you can't mix these two things because it causes a violent reaction. They realized that. The truck driver did not follow the procedures and inadvertently hooked up the sodium hydroxide into the H2SO4 tank and just let her rip. Unfortunately, concentrated sodium hydroxide pumped into the concentrated sulfuric acid, which resulted in an explosion. Thankfully, nobody died, but there was one hospitalization required. Moving on towards something a little bit more recent, companies undisclosed in the information that I could find. This happened in Singapore in 2013. Nobody died, but in this case, we've got operating procedures that were made. They were edited. They were heavily revised, but they were not followed correctly during a batch production of acetylated lanolin. The outcome was that the operator misread those operating procedures, accidentally added too much reactant, which led to a runaway reaction downstream and blew apart a condenser. Fortunately, there were no injuries. That last case study kind of highlights you can have awesome procedures, but if you don't train folks when procedures change, then you might wind up in trouble. Training complements operating procedures. It just makes it more complete. And it really, if you look at it and you think about it, it's just one big feedback loop. So before there were operating procedures, there was just practical use, like you did the process following these steps. Eventually somebody wrote it down and that turned into development. So after you develop procedures, you do in-class training and then you can do some field training. And then you use them practically and then you provide more feedback. Operating procedures, the thing with operating procedures is that they need to be succinct. They need to be short and they need to be sweet and they need to be simple. They can't be overly complex. They need to have just the right amount of information for somebody to perform a task. The thing that fills in the blanks for folks is the training. And what enriches training is experienced instructors that can expand on that in-class training and the field training with practical real-world examples. So from practical use comes feedback into development, and then also from practical use comes that enrichment that you can add to training, be it in class or in the field. So according to OSHA, there are some minimum requirements for training. One is that your training has to contain the specific safety and health hazards of the process. Two, that emergency operations are included, which includes shutdown. And then three, of course, the training should include the operating procedures themselves, which include all the safe work practices that apply to the employee's job tasks for some given process. How often should you train personnel? Well, there's a couple of different periods. It's not just a yearly basis. As I had mentioned earlier, you've got to do it for initial review. So employees that are new to a process, that's new employees or employees that have rotated into a process for the first time, you've got to give them the initial review, the initial training. Whenever there's a new version of operating procedures or the first version of operating procedures, you've got to train folks. Whenever there's changes made, so for instance, after an MOC, and then of course annually for a recertification. Some training techniques. Now these are not required by OSHA. These are just probably good ideas that you can think about. One is videos. Videos make it very easy to manage and ensure that you have a consistent message with your training, that you don't get different training just because you're using different instructors. Also, utilize controlled environments for personnel to test their understanding of those operating procedures. You can do it in front of a computer like a virtual console, or if you have the facilities to do so, you can do it on a bench scale. So for instance, mini distillation columns or mini heat exchangers or mini pumps or setups with control valves and with manual valves. And then also getting those operating procedures trained in the field on the job under direct supervision of experienced personnel. That really helps build that muscle memory. It's not just clicking a button on the computer or turning a tiny valve on a bench scale heat exchanger. It's actually being in the field, looking at the equipment that needs to be operated, knowing where to locate things, and teaching your muscles where to go and what to turn and what to push and what to pull. Accessibility. So during that training, it is so important to reiterate at every possible step where to go to find the operating procedures, where to go to access them, what the appropriate place is. That ensures that whatever your corporate standard for access or whatever that preferred route is followed. In doing that, you also, as the trainer or the manager of training or what have you, may find problems in the access. So you've got this pie-in-the-sky vision that everybody's going to go to your SharePoint site to find the operating procedures. Well, in practice and in training, if people have trouble getting to it, that's a good time to find out so you can fix it. Well, how do you evaluate whether or not your training program is any good? Understand the knowledge level of fully trained employees of the operating procedures. So, for instance, you could test your employees before the training, see what their knowledge level is, and then test them after the training. What else? Revise that training program based on feedback obtained from the fully trained employees. If those employees have gone through that training, they've probably got feedback to tell you, hey, it's more valuable if you tell me these things here, or hey, this part of the training is not as important because of whatever reason. Get that feedback from them. Additionally, during training is tying it back into MOC. So you don't necessarily need to talk about PHAs when you're training operating procedures, but when you're talking to your users and your operators about these operating procedures, remind them and encourage them to think about operating procedures during MOCs. So it's important that as those operators and other users are in their daily routine and in their daily work life are processing MOCs for changing some process or doing this or doing that, that when they see those MOCs come across their desk, they look at them and they think about them and they think, does this change the operating procedure? That's a really good way to capture changes to operating procedures and make sure that changes are implemented. However, you can have a really healthy and robust MOC system, but if you don't have a healthy and robust management system for your operating procedures, then all of the good stuff that comes out of an MOC might not get changed in the operating procedures unless you've got a good management system. Which brings us into long-term management. So first off, long-term management, let's talk about the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things, paper versus electronic. I probably don't need to convince you or spend very much time trying to convince you that paper-based systems have gone the way of the dodo. The electronic systems are the way to go. And I'm not talking about printing out operating procedures and that's your paper-based system. What I'm talking about when I say paper-based management system is literally everything is done on paper. Like you go to check out things on paper. You make changes to things on paper. It's all paper, paper, paper. Obviously, it's much easier, much faster, much more efficient to do things electronically with a word processor, with a database, with your SharePoint or your LiveLink or your Documentum or whatever. So yeah, of course, electronic systems are much more superior than paper-based systems. So what's the big problem? Some organizations have made that conversion and they found the promised land. They've moved away from paper-based systems and now everything's electronic, and that's the way they want it because now they can be ISO 9001 certified and all this other good stuff, and their employees love it because they know exactly where to go and everything's automated and it's beautiful. But a lot of organizations have not made it there. Small organizations, medium-sized organizations, it's a lot of work to move away from an old paper-based system into an electronic system. They've started, they stopped, they never started, and then the company was acquired by some other company and nobody put any time towards it. So you've got these in-betweeners that are kind of flailing with appropriate management of their operating procedures. If you're going to take on operating procedures and take on the long-term management, if you find yourself as one of those cow skulls on the side of the road trying to make your way to the promised land of operating procedures, start thinking about life cycle. You've got to start thinking about the responsibilities of certain individuals to manage those operating procedures. So first thing you think about is who is responsible for drafting that operating procedure? Who needs to review it? Who needs to approve it? Which department does it belong to? And how frequently do I need to do the review? Is it every year, or is it every 6 months, or is it every 3 months? Along with that is continuous improvement. whenever you're developing that management system, it's good to standardize the process that you use to create and update those operating procedures. And it's a lot easier electronically than it is by paper. You can utilize a centralized location for operating procedures retrieval so that employees know where to get them. And then you can set automatic reminders to evaluate those operating procedures once a year or at whatever frequency you want to. And then also, electronically, it's a lot easier to incorporate employee and contractor feedback. But you have to sustain the process by making sure somebody is in charge of it. That could be you, or that could be your designee if you have such power to wield. Additionally, it's important to automate that distribution process, which is made so easy with electronic systems. So people are notified when there's the first draft, when the initial review is due, when the approval process is going on, when publishing is finished, and then whenever there's a periodic review necessary. You've got to grant roles and controls to all those folks that are responsible for distribution or are responsible for certain parts of the development process. For instance, document controllers, the owner of the operating procedure, the users of the operating procedure, and then the department that it belongs to. Moving on into summary, kind of to capture everything one more time. Operating procedures are a written set of instructions that, when you follow them, reduce deviation from designed intentional actions. They're an integral part of several other parts of the PSM standard, including process safety information, process hazard analysis, and employee training, not to mention MOCs. And electronic management systems used for operating procedures have very clear advantages over paper-based management systems. Where can you learn more? Well, there's a couple of places. AICHE CCPS has a really good reference book. It's a little dated, but it's still pretty good. It's called Guidelines for Writing Effective Operating and Maintenance Procedures. And then there's a little bit more of a contemporary reference technical book by Sutton. The Sutton Technical Book, Process, Risk, and Reliability Management, 2nd edition. Sutton also has an e-book specific to operating procedures on the Sutton website. I'm sure you can do a Google search and find it. And now I'm just going to open it up for questions and answers. If you have a question, go ahead and use the chat as Pam had instructed earlier. And so I'm going to let Pam go ahead and go through those questions and start asking them.
Okay, thank you, Justin. We have a few questions. Please send more on. We have a little time to answer them. So the first one, can operating procedures reference SDS for the hazards, PPB, et cetera, if it is an actionable step in the SOP to review the SDS? Sorry about all these. Or do we have to pull the information out and insert into every SOP?
So I understand the question exactly, and this is where you have to strike a balance between, does my operating procedure need to be 3 pages long, or does it need to be 27 pages long because I've got 3 MSDSs to stack in there? That is a question that the owner, operator, user, whoever controls those must decide. I can provide my opinion on it. There's no requirement that you have to have those SDSs inside of your operating procedures. But my recommendation would be this. If it is easy for your users and your operators to look at those operating procedures and know exactly where to pull those SDSs from and to do it quickly as part of their regular routine, then I don't think you need to include them. However, if your operating procedures are, if your operating procedures and your other safety data information is not as easily accessible when people need to access it, then it may make more sense to have a hybrid system. So for instance, somebody has their operating procedures that they've got a hard copy in the field or in the control room. They also have the SDS's hard copy in the field or in the control room that they can reference rapidly. And then, well, yeah, I think that's my recommendation, is to do something like that, and to not necessarily include all of those SDSs as part of the operating procedures. Because the other thing is that SDSs can change over time. Are you going to remember to change that when you change the operating procedures, or to change the operating procedures whenever you change the SDS? That's a good question, though. Thanks.
Thank you. Is it a good idea to include why certain steps are included to avoid situations like CIPS explosion?
Yes, it is important to include the consequences of deviation. That's a requirement of PSM, requirement of OSHA. You need to let people know what happens if you deviate from the operating procedures. You may not need to go into nitty-gritty detail, but there needs to be a simple, plain English description of what can happen if you don't follow the procedure.
Okay, thank you. Regarding a review of operating procedures, if we review procedures after defined frequency, is it necessary to go through the whole approval cycle, or will just an email suffice that the procedure has been reviewed?
There is no specific, what is the word I'm looking for? There's no prescriptive requirement from OSHA that says you shall have a process that looks like this. An email may suffice. It may totally suffice. But you've got to make sure that you consistently apply that sort of system when it's needed and that it's well documented. There may be other constraints on your organization, like if you have certain ISO certifications about document control and retention and management and all these other cool things, you may be beholden to those requirements, which require you to have a very formalized or much more rigid document control structure where you've got to go through the history and you've got to have a formal review, and email doesn't suffice. You've actually got to sign it, things like that. It really depends on a couple of items. Short answer, it may be okay just to use an email as long as your documentation is good and auditable.
Okay, thanks. Why do most companies have a one-tier operating procedure format? For example, every operating procedure follows the same format. Do you think operating procedures should be on a risk tier-based format?
That is a really good question. I want to hold that question for further discussion and answer giving. I can't think of a really good phrase. I want to provide a better answer. But I need some time, so I want to make sure that I get that answered in the published presentation.
Okay, thank you. Must existing OPs be reviewed annually or just during five-year PHAs, assuming no MOCs?
If this is part of a PSM compliant or PSM covered process, it needs to be every year. If it's outside of that, then you can do it maybe on whatever frequency you want to, but maybe it does make sense to use best practice and do it on a yearly basis and not a 5-year basis like a PHA. If it's PSM covered, definitely once per year, not every 5 years.
Okay, thank you. Should paper OPs be required as backup to potentially unavailable electronic versions?
Well, that is a very good question for the owner-operator to answer for themselves. My opinion is the answer is yes. You need to have paper backups, because sometimes the power goes off, sometimes your credentials don't work and you can't get into SharePoint or SOP or Documentum or LiveLink or whatever your document retention system is. So yes, always have a paper backup.
Okay, thanks. The volume of technical procedure information has grown tremendously over the years, making it increasingly difficult to effectively manage. Are there any software platforms you have seen to be most effective at managing procedures?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would love to tell you that Providence Consulting has the silver bullet to solve this problem. That's otherwise a really good question. Let me see if I can find out some better information to answer that in the published version of this presentation.
Okay, thanks. Are there any process safety key performance indicators or benchmarks that can be used to assess the overall health of operational compliance and excellence? Also, please offer some highlights of auditing of procedures and adherence to them.
So that's like a two-parter. Are there any KPIs that you can use to measure to make sure either your procedures are written well or used well or understood well? Sure there are. You can do testing of operators or users before and after they've gone through training to understand whether or not the procedures are understood, whether or not the training is good. As far as the use of operations for an O&E, for an operations excellence audit, for instance, an O&E audit, whether or not there's a fixed system to use to kind of measure against when you're going to do the audit, Probably not. There's probably, well, maybe there is. Ooh, long answer short. How do I make that a short answer? I'm going to skip that part. Pam, can you repeat the second part of the second question?
Okay, I'm going to have to find that. Sorry, we've gotten a lot of questions in. Was this it? Are there any process safety key performance indicators, benchmarks that can be used to assess the overall health of operational compliance, excellence? Yeah, that was it. Also, please offer some highlights of auditing of procedures and adherence to them.
So I think the easy way for, so in auditing, what I found is that the easy way, the simple audit says, hey, operator, do you know where to find the operating procedures? And the operator says, yes, here they are. It is much more difficult to capture that cutting corners and actual using the operating procedures as they're intended, except through doing kind of a more in-depth, what do you call it, like an interview process, where you really ask how they do things and compare it very closely to what the written operating procedure is. Fairly labor intensive, but that's the way where I've seen it kind of discovered through auditing. The other way is when if something serious or bad happens, like an incident, is when through investigation it's found that people didn't follow the operating procedures. Hopefully that doesn't happen, and that never happens. But the good way to find it in an O&E audit is through kind of time-intensive, going from operator to operator and doing those interviews.
Okay, thank you. How should high-level philosophies of processes be delivered to the organization? For example, how do you manage documenting the principles of hazardous energy control versus equipment-specific isolation procedures?
Oh, yikes, that's a detailed question. As far as letting the organization know about, I'd say, certain risks involved with the process, that's a part of PSI, not necessarily a part of operating procedures. Operating procedures may rely on that information or refer to it, but that sounds like PSI. The second part of the question sounds like a doozy. Sorry, Pam, can you repeat it, that last part?
Okay, here we go again, sorry. Yes, how do you manage documenting the principles of hazardous energy control versus equipment-specific isolation procedures?
That may be user-specific, not user as in an individual, but that may be user-specific with respect to the process or the company or the owner-operator. I'll think about that one. I'll see if I can put together a more robust answer in the published document.
Okay, sure, thanks. Let's see, you're getting lots of questions, Justin, so I know you're going to be able to answer all of them later on. Here's one. I've never been a fan, but could you please speak to read and understand as a method of training?
So, not a fan. I don't understand the first part, the first part of that, but the effectiveness and to read. I'm sorry, I got caught up in the first part of that. I'm sorry to ask you to repeat the question, Pam. Say it again.
Okay, no problem. Could you please speak to read and understand as a method of training? The person said initially they're not a fan of this, but they still want to know more, I think.
Okay, so not a fan of being told, read this and tell me what it says. Well, I think that's a good way to learn how to use operating procedures is to mix in the written information, read the written information, understand it, and be tested on it, followed by doing it in the field, reading it, understanding it, doing it, and then being tested on it. Reading and understanding seems like a pretty good way to make sure that folks understand the operating procedures, whether or not they're fans or not.
Okay, thank you. If I understood, you mentioned that if the procedure is too complex, we need to start to think we need to start to redefine the process. Can you explain further?
Ooh, no. So I don't want to be misunderstood there. If a process is, if the steps to operate a process are so lengthy and complex that it leads itself to operators cutting corners to save time, or if the process itself is so complex and dangerous that a misstep in following the procedure can lead to disaster, then you should consider reorganizing the process and not necessarily the operating procedures.
Okay, great, thanks. Hello, I'm a young flow assurance engineer. Thank you for this webinar. What if the operating procedure is difficult to execute or judged by the operator as not practical and no other solutions, economic solutions, exist? Is there a way to be certain that the procedure will be executed?
Well, it sounds like if it's too difficult to execute, then people, where there's a will, there's a way. People are going to find a better way, quote, I'm using air quotes, a better way to do a procedure or to get some result that they want, even if it's outside the procedures. If something is not economically feasible with the procedures that are given, that's tough. That's time for a feedback loop. And I think there needs to be a kumbaya moment between the procedure owner, the operators that are being asked to perform the procedure, this young flow assurance engineer, and the people that are holding the money bags to say, hey, we can't do what this procedure says in an effective way. It's going to cost more money to keep people safe. I think a lot of organizations, when they hear safe, that trumps money any day. But if something is so uneasy to do or so unsafe to do, that's a sticky situation, but it certainly calls for feedback. So young flow assurance engineer, call a meeting and be like, hey guys and girls, this is not going to work. Start that feedback loop.
Okay, thank you. For routine and typically simple tasks like pump switches, is it typical to have one generalized operating procedure for the entire site? Or would you expect separate procedures for every single spared pump in the facility? What is more common in your experience?
The former. As long as the setup, say you've got pump A and pump B in process 1, in process 2, in process 3, in process 4, if the setup is the exact same, then it's fairly common to have the exact same procedures for switching out those pumps. As long as it's very simple, as long as it's very clear to the user or the operator that pump A and pump B or whatever they're called is very clear and it's consistent across the site, then yeah, of course you can use the same operating procedure.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to inquire, quote, if we have to operate process beyond operating range in case of emergency situation, end quote, how to cover it?
So what I'm wondering is whether or not to operate something in an emergency, you've got to go outside of your prescribed kind of boundary conditions on safe operating conditions like temperature and pressure and what have you. That sounds kind of dangerous. I'd be curious to know if this is a normal enough. No, it wouldn't be covered in the PHA, I don't think. Ooh, that's a really good question. I'll think about that one. Let me answer it in the published notes.
Okay, thank you. Usually the operating manuals and procedures are developed while the project team are in the after FEED phase and right into the execute step. How can we make sure by doing review and maybe HAZOP on the OM can include process safety requirements as a result of these reviews early enough into the concept selected?
So it sounds like you're working with an engineering contractor through these steps. First and foremost, make sure it's part of the contract for the engineering contractor to incorporate that into their costs. There's no single bullet to make sure that all of that stuff happens, but I'd say that project management is where that direction needs to come from. It's kind of difficult if you're an individual contributor, you know, working on flow assurance or release systems or just the PHA. It's kind of difficult to have that weight and authority to make sure it gets done, but you can always chime in for other projects, and you can always be a squeaky wheel until you get what you want.
Okay, thanks. What are the specific restrictions to the use of operating procedures in a digital format instead of hard copies?
Well, I think there's always like the physical restrictions. I mean, it may not be possible to carry a tablet. Like, you've got all these like images of like the future, and people are carrying around these tablets in the field and all this other cool stuff. That's not necessarily easy because those tablets may not be safe, and you know, they may cause an explosion if you go into the wrong area. In order to overcome all that digital stuff, that's why it's good to just have paper copies. I don't know, it's whatever the obvious limitations are, well, that's the limitation. Operating procedures make sense if you're at a computer console. they don't necessarily make sense if you're out in the field.
Right, thank you. We have electronic software that we used for writing and formatting operating procedures. However, some people in operation would like to replace the software for when an MOC is needed and not follow the MOC for the SOPs. Is this acceptable?
Oh, geez. On the face of it, it does not sound like it's acceptable. However, I think it's a case-by-case basis. I don't know if I can provide a very good answer to that one.
Okay, thank you, Justin. I know we had lots of questions, lots of long questions, so I look forward to seeing your some additional answers in the PDF. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions right now, so as Justin mentioned, you are totally welcome to send in your questions. In addition to the questions that weren't answered, we will answer, or Justin will answer questions sent in after the webinar as well. Please send to producer@aiche.org. And now, on behalf of, yep.
I was going to qualify that. These are some really good questions and really detailed questions. Y'all are kind of brutal, and I appreciated it. I will try my darndest to get to every single one of those questions. But if there's a ton of them, I'm just going to select the best ones.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think that we had a great audience today and a lot of interest, so a lot of questions. So now on behalf of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers and everyone who attended today, I'd like to thank Justin Phillips for this very informative presentation. Thanks also to our participants for your cooperation. Please visit aiche.org to replay the session or to view and sign up for our many others. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in a webinar soon. Thank you.